You know, the late Rush Limbaugh was famous for saying that the Democrats, the liberals, they use the same plays out of the same playbook over and over to the point it just becomes so absolutely predictable. So we have this boondoggle of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package now that was passed with bipartisan support because 13 members of the Republican Party, I don't know if they defected or they just revealed that they've really been Democrats dressed in Republican drag, but they voted for it. And so now we've got this bill that is supposedly going to pay for roads and bridges and infrastructure. And you know full well that most of it is going to be squandered. There will never be an accounting for how it was spent, what it was spent on. And one of the flags that the Democrats will throw up the flagpole that they know immediately makes people nervous and they'll back off is they gotta somehow make it about race. And Mayor Pete, now Secretary of Transportation, wasted no time in inferring that our road system, our interstate system, is racist.
I'm still surprised that some people were surprised when I pointed to the fact that if a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or it would have been, in New York was designed too low for it to pass by, that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices. I don't think we have anything to lose by confronting that simple reality.
Almost as soon as he made those comments, immediately Twitter erupted. He was mocked, he was ridiculed, and of course, you had the usual that came running to his defense, like the Washington Post, fact-checking and saying, no, he's actually right. Only now, 24 hours later, they've posted a retraction of their defense of Pete. So let's break this down and let's take a look at what it is he's actually talking about, because apparently now asphalt is prejudiced, according to Pete. Now, he said that because it was like, ooh, I've never heard that before. That's interesting. What he was actually doing was quoting from a book published back, I believe it was like 1970, Robert Caro's The Power Broker, which was about Robert Moses, who was the if you will, the architectural and infrastructure guru of New York City in most of the 20th century. He wanted New York City to be a modern metropolis, and he kind of envisioned New York City being the way that Walt Disney first saw Epcot in Florida, not being another theme park, but literally being this like city of the future that was eco-friendly and mass transit and everything simple and clean and uniform. And, well, Robert Moses had a way of exerting his influence and power and control in getting things the way he wanted it. When the Brooklyn Dodgers wanted to build a new stadium right there in Brooklyn, it was Robert Moses that wouldn't let them have the property that they wanted to have. And it was going to be a beautiful stadium. It was going to be one of the very first enclosed stadiums. That would have been in the late 1950s. Robert Moses wanted them to go out in Queens where they were going to put the World's Fair. And Robert O'Malley, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers at that time, Roger O'Malley, rather, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers at that time, said, no, if we're going to go out to Queens, might as well go out to California, where it's really nice. And that's what he did. And eventually, the New York Mets and Shea Stadium landed where Robert Moses wanted to place the Brooklyn Dodgers. I said all that to say, yes, Robert Moses had a lot of influence of how the road systems were going to work around New York City. He understood people were moving out of the boroughs and out to the suburbs, but they needed to get back into the city to go to work. So he was part of the whole Eisenhower interstate system. And what Pete Buttigieg is doing is basically trashing one of the greatest technological wonders of the mid 20th century, which was the interstate system, which allowed everyone, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whoever, the opportunity to go anywhere. There was no dividing of cities based on black and white neighborhoods. It was about the economy, stupid. In other words, you weren't going to put an interstate exit into an economically depressed, repressed area. And I would remind you that back in the time of the 1950s, 1960s, when a lot of this construction was underway, that wasn't necessarily, quote, black neighborhoods. It was just poor neighborhoods, poor immigrant neighborhoods in a lot of our major cities, like German neighborhoods, Japanese neighborhoods, Russian neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's just so off. In fact, the Washington Post, in doing their retraction of their defense of Mayor Pete, had to acknowledge that the book, The Power Broker, has been largely debunked through the years. And of course, their one claim that Robert Moses purposely made the overpasses low so that buses that had black and Hispanic kids on them couldn't get under it, and so they couldn't get out to the beaches of New York City. I mean, that's just beyond ludicrous and stupid. New York City was designed for mass transit, which meant white people took buses to places too. And by the way, those buses did make it to the beach, and they made it to places all over the coastline of New York and to Coney Island. And the idea that they were purposely made low to keep passengers who happened to be non-white from getting places would be then so the buses for black people were different than the buses for white people? What it really was, it was the 1950s, 1960s, and there was no, quote, standard size at that time, uniform size. We have certain things now that everything is standard and uniform. Windows and doorways for your home, they're all made in certain standard sizes unless you do a custom job. Well, the same is true even with our roadways. They have to be X number of feet apart, and all overpasses have to guarantee X as far as clearance, etc. But there wasn't that. So these overpasses were different sizes depending on the area, depending on the money they had to work with, etc., etc., etc. Not to mention, the vehicles weren't standard size at that time, and things were now getting bigger. And a lot of those overpasses were designed when tractor trailers and buses sat lower. But then, of course, along comes a good Democratic bureaucrat who decides that you need more head clearance in a transit bus, so they jack it up 10 inches, and now, poof, Shazam, Batman, all of the overpasses have got to be ripped out and rebuilt because they're not high enough for the bus to fit through. This was the kind of stuff that was happening, because this is what happens when Democrats and liberals start mucking it all up. And of course, Mayor Pete, really what he did was he revealed what the vast majority of this money is going to be spent on. And it sure isn't infrastructure. This is money that's going to be paid to all types of think tanks and far liberal loon groups and individuals, whether, they're going to ramp up racism on asphalt or whatever. This is about giving them money for all of their support during the last presidential election and to make sure that they stay on board. This is just grift. That is all this is. This is for grifters. That is all this is, and that's what Mayor Pete was shilling for. This is just one big grift. They will never be able to account where any of this money went, and if anybody speaks up and demands an accounting, immediately they'll say, you're racist, because we're looking into, he's talking about spending $1 billion on meeting with community groups to find out how we can bring the community back together. In some cases, we will have to tear down overpasses and go underground. Really? I'll bet those communities will love being ripped up like that. And by the way, for some of you black progressives that are watching this and waiting to jump on and just rip into me, can you say gentrification? See, if there is any money spent on really rerouting overpasses and beltways through the city to make them accessible now to the quote black neighborhoods, you do know where that kind of money gets spent, other money's going to get spent to buy up all the houses and the properties and clean them up. Do we know what that means? Do we know what that's about? Gentrification? In other words, we're going to rip up your whole community. It's going to be ripped up for years while we take this overpass and make it now an underpass, totally killing what might have been left of that economy there. Rich developers will come in, buy up all the property for pennies on the dollar, knowing that the new overpass, the new interstate exit right there means restaurants and shopping centers and high-priced apartments and gentrification. And some of you black community leaders that are standing there with Pete Buttigieg saying, yes, thank you, Pete, thank you. Think. Hey, just a quick rant. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Smack the bell, click the word all to get notification of my next rant.